Hi, this is Yaz,
And I'm Candy.
and this is part two of the CIA coup against Mossadegh of Iran 1953 called Operation AJAX.
Again, welcome back to the Sabotage Zine and Scene. We hope you enjoy. Starting off, we're going to give a little bit of a sum up of what we talked about last time, just in case some people might have missed it. It was a huge read through that we were doing on some CIA documents. Quick sum up, we're going to talk about the nationalization of Iranian oil because essentially that was what this whole thing was about the entire time. So, the AIOC, or the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, was nationalized by the Iranian government or Iranian parliament in March of 1951, meaning that they wanted to keep more of their profits. Rightfully so. In Iran, this was enormously popular and seen as a long overdue staunching of the bleeding of its national wealth, which could now be harnessed to fighting poverty in Iran. In Britain, the nationalization was widely seen as an intolerable breach of contract or theft. British emissaries in the United States after the nationalization argued that allowing Iran to nationalize the oil company would be widely regarded as a victory for the Russians. If any of you have been following us, even for a brief second, you know that we have brought this up time and time again, that this is just a catchphrase out of the imperialist playbook. So this would also cause a loss of £100 million per annum in the UK's balance of payments, thus seriously affecting our rearmament program and our cost of living. Oh, poor babies. British warships actually blockaded Abadan, which is a city in Iran, on the 22nd, a port city as well. On the 22nd of August, the British cabinet imposed a series of economic sanctions on Iran. It prohibited exports of key British commodities, including sugar and steel, directed the withdrawal of all British personnel from the Iranian oil fields, and all but a hardcore of about 300 administrators from Abadan, and blocked Iran's access to its hard currency accounts in British banks. So this was not only a physical sanction, this was financial, and this was also pretty much a starvation of food as well as needed materials just for infrastructure. This is what empire does. Again, United States is great at this, and they learned from the best, as we can see here. After the withdrawal of British workers in the fall of 1951, the Iranians felt confident that they could easily hire non-British technicians to run the industry, then quickly train their own nationals to replace them. However, this did not prove to be the case. The United States, Sweden, Belgium, the Netherlands, Pakistan, and West Germany all refused to make their technicians available to the nationalized Iranian oil industry. Only Italy agreed, demonstrating that the most industrialized countries supported Britain over Iran in the nationalization dispute. Surprise, surprise. Colonizers stick together. In 1952, the Royal Navy intercepted the Italian tanker, the Rosemary, and forced it into British protectorate of Aden on the grounds of the ship's petroleum was stolen property. News that the Royal Navy was intercepting tankers carrying Iranian oil scared off other tankers and effectively shut down oil ports from Iran. Really funny about this is that the West wants to get all up in arms about what the Houthis are doing, and obviously we see they were the predecessors of this. So now that we have kind of an imagery of what started this whole debacle in the involvement of the CIA, now we're going to give a brief summary of the actual coup. Prime Minister, who was elected by the Shah and approved by the Majlis, was overthrown on the 19th of August, August 19th of 1953, following a coup d'etat orchestrated by the United States and the United Kingdom. During the coup, codename Operation AJAX, the CIA and MI6 restored Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to power. In August 1954, the AIOC was set under the control of an international consortium. Initially, ownership shares in the consortium proposed to be divided among the following lines. Now, this means this is how profits from Iranian oil were going to be divided up. And when you get the numbers, you'll get a sense of why the Iranian government was pissed. 40% to be divided equally, 8% each to 5 of the major American oil companies with BP. Shell would get 14%, Shell Oil Company, so the Dutch, and CFP would get 6%. This leaves Iran with now 25% of the profits compared to 20%, which was of the original treaty. So the oil is coming from your country, but you only get 20 to 25% of the profits. And remember what Yazid read last time. Another main reason for the nationalization is because the British government was not allowing audits from the Iranian government to see if they were even receiving their proper royalties and dividends from the company, from the oil being processed and refined. This was the cause for nationalization because Iran thought they were getting screwed over, and when they wanted to verify that, they weren't allowed to.
I have actually read a report, and if I find it, I will link it to this episode, but I've read a report a couple months ago that said that actually Iran was only able to see 5% of what they were promised as a share.
I believe it. I mean, there's a reason why you're not going to let people see the numbers. After we have that 40%, remember in a couple of episodes ago, actually, no, 2 episodes ago, when Yaz and I were talking about Syria and how the coup in Syria is what pretty much set up the petrodollar, right? So now that we have that in our minds, we need to read this sentence together. Saudi Arabia and other oil exploiting countries of the region received up to 50% of the profits in cooperation with American oil companies at the same time. So here we see this is the feeding of what we have today. Okay, this is how the petrodollar became so large and easily accessible, because they had persuaded other countries in the region, sort of as proxies, if you will. And now not only as a physical proxy, but a financial and infrastructure proxy.
Absolutely. The Aramco is responsible for the coup in Syria and is also responsible for killing Yemenis, for example. That's why Saudi Arabia has a base where American drones can obviously be stationed there and kill Yemenis, because it's all about oil. Yemen refused to get this oil pumped by the Brits, and Yemen fought the Brits. They won. They pushed out the colonizer. On the other hand, Saudi Al Saud family, which is the crown family right now, which obviously the country is named after, decided to strike a deal with the US and Great Britain, and that's one of the reasons why they're extremely rich right now.
Yes, and furthering that, this was something that's been going around. I have to do a little bit more research on, but just common sense-wise, it makes sense. Wow, there was a lot of sense in that sentence. The reason why the ceasefire is being pushed is because they are trying to make better ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia, because the US wants to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. So Trump is trying to facilitate that, which would be incredibly horrible for that region.
Which he also, by the way, had very good ties, especially via Kushner, which is his, son-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Abrahamic Accords, I believe they're called. Abraham Accords, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he is the reason why Saudi Arabia has also had to normalize, right? And then he received, obviously, money from Saudi Arabia. And I would add to this that the spread of Salafism and Wahhabism, which are both currents that were created in order to kill a lot of natives around, because Wahhabism and Salafism have mostly targeted Muslims and killed Muslims, and we're talking about revolutionary Lebanese people, revolutionary Yemenis, etc. And it is a actual doctrine that is pushed by the US and pushed by the UK. Obviously, it does not represent Islam as a whole or historically. So it is very important to see that there is not only an ideological war, a propagandist war, but the US is also making a religion an accommodation. They are changing their religion, just like they changed Christianity, going from Mohammedanism to evangelicalism, etc. They're trying to do the same via Saudi, which is a very interesting thing to see, as a lot of the things that you see in Saudi are very different from how historically the religion has been practiced. And that is due to the fact that America is fueling an ideology that targets and kills Muslims and is, a terrorist mentality, like the ISIS, for example, knowing that ISIS is an American proxy. It is the same ideology. Like most of ISIS are Wahhabis, they're Salafis, that's what they are.
Yep, Americans put the can and can manipulate. On top of that, from our financial audience, the US also has to tread lightly in that sense, because BRICS has companies that are going to be up and coming. China has already been to Africa several times. They have announced that the US will be no longer receiving precious metals from China, which that destroys the tech industry because Biden was supposed to facilitate where they could find those materials in the US. And obviously they have failed in that campaign because even if they did find it, they wouldn't be able to pay for it. On top of, you now have China dropping and going 0% embargoes with poorer countries on both imports and exports. So right now, the US needs to do something. And unfortunately, the US looks like an absolute bully even more now to what they're doing in the Middle East, but they can't afford to lose it at the same time. That's kind of one of the reasons why I'm hearing this ceasefire, which love that for the people of Palestine, even if it's only temporary. They more than deserve it. And I'm happy for their joy, but I will say this, I don't trust it long term. Same thing with Syria. Love that their people received freedom, but if the US is involved, it's not good. It will not be good long term.
Just a quick reminder that Israel has already killed 3 people since the ceasefire has been in place.
Yes, which I hate to say this, it did not surprise me. I'm actually more surprised that the totals weren't higher because Netanyahu, that individual, has already been obviously grossly against this and making his little threats and whatnot on Twitter, basically playing the Middle Eastern Trump card. So again, I'm not surprised.
Well, he's not Middle Eastern. He's Polish. But
yeah, but I'm saying he plays the Israeli part really well. He should get an Oscar, which is awesome because they're coming up soon. Okay, and just finishing up with this, in April of 1951, the Majlis nationalized the Iranian oil company by unanimous vote, and the National Iranian Oil Company was formed, displacing the AIOC. The AIOC withdrew its management from Iran and organized an effective worldwide embargo of Iranian oil. The British government, which owned AIOC, contested in the nationalization at the International Court of Justice, that thing that they crucify now, but yet they'll use it when it's beneficial to them. At The Hague, the complaint was dismissed and the NIOC was established right after with the nationalization of oil. So that is where we're at now. And you guys want to talk about with the coup, and then we're going to talk about the aftermath.
Thank you for that sum up, Candy. I would get back now to reading the document that is obviously a CIA document. I have it on my hand. It is a bunch of CIA documents put together and a study around what this means and an attempt to put in back together what happened, what the US did. Quick reminder that the US destroyed most of these documents and still refuses to release the rest of it, even under the FOIA Act. This was approved for release in 2017. So the CIA estimated that the short-term prospects for Zahiri's government were good, although many Iranians will regret the downfall of Mossadegh and will thus provide a source of future opposition to the new regime. Most of this group will probably acquiesce at least temporarily in the change. The Tudeh party lost much of its support in the upsurge of anti-communist pro-Shah sentiment. CIA thought the Tudeh unlikely to recover its support in the near future. Zahiri faced a formidable task in dealing with the disparate elements responsible for Mossadegh's downfall, and he probably could not count on the Shah's strong support. Zahiri was pushed by the CIA and enabled by the CIA. The Shah had never supported any of his past prime ministers consistently, and CIA did not believe this would change. We are going to talk right now about the aftermath of what the US did, as we've already talked about the coup in our previous episode, part 1 of the CIA Operation AJAX. Aftermath of this entire coup was that Zahiri, who was obviously pushed there by the CIA, installed by the CIA, started consolidating his government. The situation in Tehran was still fluid, and no one knew if the Tudeh might try to instigate an armed revolt against Zahiri that could have led to civil war. As we already said in our previous episode, the Tudeh is the Communist Party of Iran. So neither Zahiri nor his military chief of staff, General Batmangelish, wanted to take any chances. Batmangelish spent the first 2 days of his tenure as chief of staff ordering selected Iranian army units to Tehran. But Batmangelish may have intended to augment the security forces already in or en route to Tehran, or he may have wanted to ensure enough show troops to greet the Shah when he returned. Show troops are basically an intimidation kind of tactic. So Batman Galish ordered battalions from Isfahan, Kerman, Tabriz, and Khorramabad to leave their garrisons for Tehran. These cities are widely separated and cover the country from the northwest to the southeast. The chief of staff may have ordered other units as well, but there is no evidence supporting additional troop movements of additional units. Each battalion en route to Iran's capital had 358 enlisted men, 79 non-commissioned officers, and 5 or 6 officers. They left with weapons, full equipment provisions for 2 days, and 1 fire unit of ammunition. Batman Galish was anxious that the units arrive in Tehran on time and ordered them to report their progress while en route. The different and widely separated home garrisons of the battalion made them unlikely co-conspirators against the new regime. The chance that any of these battalions would refuse to follow Zahidi's orders was remote. The 5 brigades in the Tehran garrison had not covered themselves with glory during the civil unrest ousted Mossadegh, and Batman Galish and Zahidi no doubt thought it prudent to have other troops in the capital who probably would not hesitate to crush a Todeh-led coup attempt. Batman Galish clearly intended these forces for more than ceremonial purposes. Troops do not parade or pass in review with live ammunition. Mossadegh's fall did not mean an immediate end to problems that had bedeviled Iran's relations with the West. Almost immediately after Operation AJAX, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs Henry Bayrod wrote a memorandum addressing 2 issues. How will the change in government affect Iranian policies, and what attitude should the US government take toward the Zahidi government? These are very interesting questions, knowing that they're the ones who installed Zahidi in the first place. It is just very weird. I sometimes wonder if they wrote these documents thinking that when these documents get declassified, they're going to look cute and innocent if they write in this way. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, you got to love the people who installed the regime didn't know what they were going to do after they did it. All they just knew that they were going to nationalize, or that they were going to stop the nationalization.
Exactly. And then they're asking, oh, well, how is this new government that we just installed going to behave towards us? Wow. Bayrod noted that a revolution of nationalism was sweeping Asia, and that any effective leader had to base his program on nationalist aspirations or face political suicide. Zahidi, therefore, was not likely to reverse many of Mossadegh's policies. Bayrod warned that American policymakers would be unwise to assume Iran will turn a new face toward the West in the immediate future. Nonetheless, he argued Zahidi merited American support. His fall, in Bayrod's opinion, would open the way to chaos and a struggle for power in which only the Tudeh organization would be likely to win. Again, fantasizing about the possibility of communists winning, which this entire coup was based on. And there is actually no proof, no real proof, no actual numbers or study that shows that that could have ever been the case. This was just them creating problems on their own, imagining the problem, and then somehow throwing some type of attempt at solving the problem by just overthrowing the country, killing people, etc. So 2 complications affected American support for the new Iranian prime minister. Zahidi lacked solid political support in his own right. Well, if he lacked political support, how did he get to power then? If you have listened to the first episode, you'll know that the US is the US who put him there. So Zahidi lacked solid political support in his own right. He could expect the Shah to thwart his efforts to create a strong government, since the Shah distrusted any strong leaders or anyone who might emerge as a strong leader. Zahidi's options were limited. He could not become a military dictator as long as the military remained loyal to the Shah, or could he seek broad-based civilian support without calling for new Majlis elections? The Majlis was notorious, in Bayrod's words, for its destructive criticism. This is so hilarious coming from an American man. Is your ego fragile? Destructive criticism. Sorry. And there was no guarantee that the new Majlis would cooperate with Zahidi. In short, Bayrod wrote, "There is no cause for jubilation that our problems are ended in Iran. On the contrary, the future can be expected to bear remarkable similarity to the recent past." It was a sobering antidote to the euphoria at the highest levels of CIA.
Man, who would have thought that your plan, even if it worked, was not going to work? So you conquer a region which you know nothing about, And then when your regime doesn't know what to do, you're surprised about it.
So,
oh, goodness.
Project Ajax left the Tudeh party weakened and demoralized. The Tudeh party, the Communist Party, preferred Mossadegh, as Mossadegh was technically a socialist. But in November 1953, the intelligence community judged that the Tudeh's disarray made it unlikely that the party would seize power. Yet they still went on with the coup.
Mm-hmm.
Just amazing. So there was an estimate entitled Probable Development in Iran through 1954 that was made by the ONE, which is the Office of Estimates for the CIA, that wrote that the Tudeh had been seriously disrupted, with many of its most active members under arrest. Zahedi, moreover, had purged known Tudeh sympathizers from government agencies. Even so, in the ONE's view, the Tudeh was not impotent and still remained capable of sabotage and terrorism. Sabotage and terrorism in their own country. This is just amazing. It's like you come to somebody else's country, but they are the terrorists because they're indigenous to the country. That's crazy. This sums up America's colonial settler frenzy in a sentence.
Yeah, on top of, I love it's the ONE who did this. So you're telling me that the same people that made this estimate that this was going to be a great idea are now telling us that, wait a minute, okay, we've done all this, but yet they can still sabotage us and perform terrorism in their own country. That had to be a report. Like, I could do a stand-up special on that.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's the same guys who are basically making money out of throwing over a government that are also telling you that, yes, it should be overthrown. Like, what? It's the same thing, the same ideology as Israel conducted an investigation on their own lies and they discovered that there were no lies. It's like, oh, wow, genius.
Yeah, the same thing as the Christian church doing the investigation on the Native American boarding schools.
The colonizer and the imperialist are hilarious. Until the archives of the former Soviet Union are fully opened, it will be impossible for scholars to know the exact reasons why the Tudeh did not act. Maybe they were never gonna act.
I was going to say, it's like you guys were literally having a wet dream over this. It was still a dream. In the words of Nelly, it was only just a dream.
Perhaps Bahrami was right in suggesting that it was only because the Tudeh was unprepared, but the reasons are probably more complex. Sure, this is what I love about Americans is they screw it up and then they're looking for some type of explanation and justification to why they screwed it up and why they made it. You just made the wrong assumption. That's it. Just admit it. Like, there doesn't have to be a bigger reason. Maybe they just were never going to make a move. But you are paranoid, so you just went ahead and slaughtered people.
Mm-hmm.
This is just so interesting.
It was only just a dream.
So Stalin had been dead for only 5 months, and the new leaders were probably reassessing his policies. They almost certainly recognized the importance of Iran to the United States and to the Soviet Union, but may have been unsure how much freedom of action they had. In any event, since the Tudeh was so closely directed from Moscow, it is not likely that the Iranian communists decided on their own to do nothing. So there is no proof of that either, that the Tudeh was so closely directed from Moscow. There is no proof. What are they? They're just throwing assumptions. And this is how I know that this study is also done by a colonizer, like is done by an imperialist too, because he's trying to justify things that are unproven till today. There is no proof of that. We've just gone over, 72 pages of CI documents, and there was absolutely no proof that the Tudeh was closely directed by Moscow or by the USSR. There was none.
And see, half the time they did all this crap, they pushed them to the Kremlin. This is the Bay of Pigs, which we're probably going to talk about eventually. They were pushed to do that.
Because they needed an ally. Because America was so on them, on their case, that they needed somebody else to, forge alliances. Yeah.
Yeah, and Castro's like, okay, watch this.
Whatever ill effects or career damage Lavrentiev suffered from Mossadegh's fall were temporary. He eventually returned to his post in Tehran and stayed until May 1955, when Moscow recalled him to participate in a commission trying to resolve outstanding Soviet-Iranian border and financial disputes. Okay, so we're going to talk about your friend Kermit.
Our boy Kermit
Roosevelt. To all the listeners, please take the time to Google his picture.
Yeah.
Very interesting person, creature.
Yeah, you want to talk about a tragedy of terrorism?
The American intelligence and diplomatic communities feted Kermit Roosevelt when he returned to Washington. It is no exaggeration to say that Project Ajax owed its success to him, in as much as headquarters and the State Department were ready to abandon the project after the initial failure on August 15th. Roosevelt had quickly seen that the essence of the operation had changed into a political action. Success came from his initiative, quick thinking, calm analysis, and ability to recognize turning points and act decisively upon them. This sounds like a resume for a terrorist that is probably rotting deep in hell right now.
Yeah.
This is funny. This is how you know the guy who wrote this definitely got opinions that are hella skewed. You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, he and Kissinger are probably in hell right now having a tea party.
I hope the tea is burning them in their tongues.
I hope the tea is Iranian.
Although CIA did not conduct an investigation or post-mortem analysis of the operation to determine what the agency did wrong and what it did right, I don't think they care. Chaos is chaos. There is.
Well, see, they were at this point they were still very new, so it's like they don't even know what they're going to accomplish, and now they
We're
just
actually
realize.
gonna. That is a very important point that we're gonna come back to. What
Yeah.
you just said. That is a very important point. But it's interesting. I mean, they didn't do their end of the year evaluation.
It's funny they wouldn't let the Iranians audit, and their auditing sucks.
Yep.
Because we know MI6 was an absolute failure.
Roosevelt in September 1953 talked about his role in TP Ajax, well, Project Ajax or Operation Ajax before a group that included President Eisenhower, Secretary of State Dulles, the Cabinet, the Joint Chief Staff of Staff, and others. Roosevelt kept his audience enthralled for 2 hours and emphasized that the operation had succeeded because it enjoyed the support of the Iranian army and the people. It also succeeded because he did not have Washington second guessing every move. Didn't they just say that Washington was unsure of how Zahedi was going to move next?
Not to mention, I'm still in awe on how they really expect us to believe that Eisenhower kept no records because he thought oral translation of history was enough. So it's like the individual that is running the country decided that he's only going to receive reports orally, and that's what they're going to base their decisions off of. Great. Fantastic.
Yeah. Cables from Tehran were scarce during the critical days of 16th to 19th of August for a good reason. Gentlemen, Roosevelt joked to general applause. I made a point of not letting you know what was happening. No one seemed more amused than Allen Dulles. Jesus, just
surprise.
Like Satan is watching meeting going on and he's like, okay, let me take notes right now. Like
this just reminds me of the rotunda when they have war criminals speaking. They're just like clapping like the monkeys with the cymbals.
Don't insult the monkeys like that. So Roosevelt cautioned his audience not to draw the wrong lessons from Project Ajax. Now we'll think we can walk on water everywhere, he said, and we've got to be careful and restrain ourselves. Buddy, you already think that. You're a settler colony. What?
Hold on, we're quoting what a Palestinian man did in that sentence after destroying Iran.
A socialist Palestinian man who was a refugee to Egypt. Yeah. That's crazy.
Oh.
Roosevelt had long thought that contradictions in American foreign policy would continue to make covert action necessary. Oh, you think? And I would like to say here, add to it, because I always got to remind everybody that America is a settler colony. America is based on contradictions. You can't have freedom on stolen land. So it's not just like foreign policy that's contradictory. The existence of America itself to give freedom to a people on stolen land is insane and is contradictory. So in 1952, he wrote that at least in the Middle East, as long as American words do not match American deeds, so long will our orthodox diplomacy in the area be hamstrung and our reliance upon clandestine operation increase. I just would like to say that this, I have already heard this. This was quoted literally by, was it? And someone in, an ex-president of the US when talking about Native Americans, because this is exactly what they did with Native Americans. They signed treaties with them and went and violated every single one of them.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, this is just this should be a coined phrase.
Exactly. So outside the Middle East, he wrote that strategic considerations, chiefly the fear of losing French or British support for NATO, often require or seem to require our pursuit of a policy which alienates large segments of the Islamic Asian world. Roosevelt also believed that the United States had a tendency to develop policy in terms of irrelevant traditional formula.
Do as I say, not as I do, and we're going to make these off of something that's not relevant.
Yeah. And we're not even going to take the time to know the culture of the people we're invading. It doesn't matter.
Nope, you're getting freedom. You should be happy with that.
Mm-hmm. Secretary of State Dulles did not heed Roosevelt's admonition. The secretary is already contemplating a similar operation in a country half a world away from Iran and much closer to home. Officials in CIA's Directorate of Plans had been working since 1952 on schemes to depose Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz. We will talk about that. The coup against Arbenz, very important. Like Mossadegh, Arbenz was willing to turn a blind eye to communist machination in his country. Arbenz himself is a socialist. Machination? You mean people like choosing to be something that you don't want them to be? That's machination? This is why you can't say freedom in America in this instance. Like, it's just insane. Even the most bitter anti-Mossadegh partisans did not claim the Iranian prime minister was a communist or a sympathizer. So I just wanted to say, like, this is the week of the 132 years marking Hawaii's overthrow. And I just like to say that Hawaii, before being overthrown, was a very known country around the world and was independent. And their government was recognized internationally and had the highest ever rate of literacy in the world. So this goes to Hawaii, free turtle islands. So,
Yeah, not to mention with Guatemala, Israel's nice little part in that.
Yeah, Jacobo Arbenz, the weapons, Israel Galilee's rifles. That's a very important topic, and we will definitely bring that up later in our next episodes. So Roosevelt's knowledge of the Middle East gave him the confidence to play the situation in Iran by ear without much headquarters involvement. His lack of Latin American expertise would have precluded a similar approach in dealing with Guatemala. Control from headquarters would necessarily have been tighter, restricting his freedom of movement. There was another important distinction between Iran and Guatemala. Arbenz controlled the comparatively stable Guatemalan government. Mossadegh presided over a shambles. At the start of 1953, according to Iranian specialist Kouros A. Sami, Iran resembled an old ship swept away by a storm with no aboard capable of dealing with the attendant frenzy. So by August, Mossadegh was barely holding on to the broken sails of his sinking ship. Everything considered, whatever might be said of the morality of the legality of American action, it still should not be characterized as having overthrown a stable regime in Iran.
I wonder why it wasn't stable.
I wonder why they just don't want to admit that they overthrown it. That's exactly what they did. Not only did they do that, there is actually articles where they have told the press, yes, we did it. We did Iran 1953. And we know that. We've seen this. We have seen the CIA documents that prove it. And we've talked about it in the first episode.
Yep.
Ample evidence that they did it.
It's like, so hold on. It's like you say you overthrew a stable government, but you forget to mention that before that happened, you guys had embargoes on them to the point where you were kind of starving them out of every piece of thing that would be essential for life.
Mm-hmm. And let's not forget that the reason why you even overthrew them was over nationalizing oil.
Mm-hmm.
So,
this is why I'm in fear for African countries that are doing this now.
I mean, I love how this person wrote this whole study and is still in denial. This is what tells you that, like, someone doing a study on something doesn't mean that they are unbiased.
Mm-hmm.
Because they have shown, the whole point of the study was to show that the CIA did actually overthrow Mossadegh in 1953, which they showed. And now they're going back on that after in the aftermath chapter. So what
gaslighting is incredible.
Gaslighting, absolutely. And that's kind of what's sad, is that people are necessarily, like, sometimes present enough in whatever they're reading that they let themselves be gaslit. I refuse to be gaslit. You literally contradicted yourself so many times, sir. Whoever wrote
this is why we needed to overthrow the Iranian government, because we needed the gas to gaslight.
There you go. What worked in Iran, Roosevelt sensed, probably would not work in Guatemala because the circumstances were so different. Neither the CIA nor the U.S. government heeded Roosevelt's warning about the seductiveness and danger of covert action, and Project PB success went forward successfully. With the overthrow of Arbenz, Jacobo Arbenz of Guatemala, many in the State Department and CIA thought American action had narrowly averted a communist government in Guatemala. So the relative rapidity and ease with which Project Ajax and Project Success, PV Success, which are the two operations that overthrow Mossadegh in Iran and the other operation who overthrow Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, had accomplished their objectives, however, deceived CIA officials. They drew the erroneous lessons that the agency could alter word events in the third word at will and with minimal expense. It would take the debacle at the Bay of Pigs in 1961 to vindicate Roosevelt, but by then the man who had brought down Mossadegh had resigned from the CIA.
I love how a failed operation is what's going to vindicate him.
That says a lot.
That is a lot of proof right there. You know who wrote this.
Mm-hmm. And here's the thing. We're going to enter a very interesting part, which I'm not going to read every single part of it because this is a document extremely full of propaganda. But chapter 6, evaluating Operation Ajax. So during the 1979...
I was going to say, just for our listeners, clear definition of the word vindicate is to clear someone of blame or suspicion. Let that sink in for a second. Sorry, I had to get that out there because that was just such a contradiction, and I had to let our listeners know by how much.
Yeah. So here, during the 1979-1981 Iranian hostage crisis, a reporter asked President Jimmy Carter whether he thought that it was proper for the United States to restore the Shah to the throne in 1953 against the popular will within Iran. Instead of correcting the reporter's loaded question, the president replied, "That's ancient history, and I don't think it's appropriate or helpful for me to go into the propriety of something that happened 30 years ago." And there is nothing to correct about that question, by the way. The US did overthrow Mossadegh. And they did basically, through overthrowing Mossadegh to a certain extent, meddle with the entire... This is also something that Americans do not like to talk about, is that how this is the result of what you see today in Iran. Iran still has an embargo on it. Not only that, the Shah, the Khomeini revolution that happened in the late 70s was a direct problem that emanated from that in the 50s. As much as they're like, well, that was 25 years later. Exactly. Chain of events. The way Haiti is the way it is today is because the US never stopped meddling with Haiti. The coups in the 90s, the coups in the 2000s, till today, they're still like sending them weapons via Miami and like training. Every single person that did a coup in Haiti was trained by the DEA in the US. And those chain of events are what give birth to the chaotic situations that you see these countries in. I would even say that these countries are really fantastic for how much they've been through at the hands of the US.
With as much as they've been restricted, like Cuba.
Exactly.
They tried to perform a coup in Cuba last year, and they still failed.
Oh, Bolivia last year as well. And they failed. Kenya, I mean, now they have control over Kenya. So the contemporary views about the project or the Operation Ajax in the national interest. So official Washington thought that Operation Ajax was a stunning victory for the West. The operation almost certainly prevented Iran from sliding into political anarchy and becoming a target too tempting for the Tudehanid Soviet mentors to ignore. I want you to listen to the propaganda in this entire, in these words. In the short term, a stable Zahidi government, which was not stable at all because we know that he didn't have enough political support and that the people did not like him, permitted a rapid settlement of the Anglo-Iranian oil dispute, thereby restarting the flow of oil and providing a much-needed boost for the sagging Iranian economy. This is a total lie. It actually provided the Brits with more colonialism and more pillaging and theft, what they've been wanting to do. So basically, the US just meddled with Iran to make sure that Iran is forever colonized by the Anglo-Iranian oil company.
Or making it so much of a disaster that it's unwanted by any other world power.
Exactly. And let's not forget that the name is deceiving. Anglo-Iranian oil company. It is not Iranian. It is a British oil company. And like Candella has noted before, BP, as we know of it today, It's the name.
Yep. It was renamed. And I love how they use the word anarchy in there when that has nothing to do with political at all. It's actually the absence of it.
Mm-hmm. So sending American troops to Iran was never a practical option for logistical and political reasons. An American military occupation almost certainly would have led to war. The USSR would have invoked the terms of the 1921 Treaty of Friendship between Iran and the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic and occupied the northern part of the country. Iran would have been divided into a communist north and a free south. Communist north, but the south is free. Free south, because capitalism is freedom.
Does this sound familiar to anybody?
Germany, perhaps?
Korea?
Mm-hmm.
An attempt in Vietnam?
Yep. Northern Free South. Fear of partition lay behind Washington's objection to the proposed British occupation of the port city of Abadan early in the oil nationalization crisis. A covert political operation promised to attain American foreign policy and strategic in objectives Iran without the threat of war. CIA gave the Eisenhower administration flexibility where diplomacy had failed and military action was not practical. What they mean by like it had failed is these people said, no, we don't want to be colonized. That's it. That's what failed. Because if you don't want to be colonized, the US will go ahead and make a coup and do a CIA coup, a CIA like intervention so that they still colonize you regardless, because they do not actually care about diplomacy, because they do not respect who they're talking to. Because the second that person wants the right to self-determination, they override them, just like they did to Native Americans, just like they did to every single, everything around America, everyone, Puerto Rico, Guam, everyone. These people, how come that these people always fail at diplomacy? So the US has to do a coup. Or maybe is it that the US doesn't care about diplomacy? It cares about colonialism. And the second you oppose colonialism, they will find a way to still colonize. In addition, CIA gave the US government plausible deniability. If a covert action went awry, the president could deny American involvement. With these considerations in mind, and given the widely held Western outlook on the international situation in general and on Soviet intentions in particular, the Eisenhower administration decision to act in Iran was reasonable and understandable. Look at them justifying themselves. So
Well,
sweet.
see, that's the example of, what is it? Words don't match the actions. That's their whole strategy. It's like they gaslight themselves and think the rest of the world is going to be like, yeah, that sounds about right.
Exactly. You sound about super logical right now.
Yeah.
But the fact that, for example, the CIA gave the US government plausible deniability, if a covert action went awry, the president could deny American involvement. This is what we're talking about when a lot of us across the world are like, that looks like America's nasty work. And everybody in the US is like, no, that could never be America. That's freedom. And it's like plausible deniability, buddy.
Yeah.
That's
That is a colonizer term.
Absolutely. It's very interesting here. I'm going to talk about this. Project AJAX they said, did CIA restore the Shah to his throne? Operation AJAX did not restore the Shah to his throne technically or constitutionally. That is totally false. Although the Iranian monarch left Tehran during the operation, he never abdicated. Mossadegh's argument that the Shah's firmans were invalid was disingenuous. The Iranian constitution gave the Shah the right to dismiss the prime minister. As soon as Mossadegh refused to obey the Shah's legal order, he was rebelling against constitutional authority. From that point, Project AJAX became an operation to remove the usurper Mossadegh. It's funny that he's a usurper now, because we just heard that he had Iranians people's vote by far, and that they voted for him and they wanted him in power. And this is again where the US is playing on terms and words and lying through and through, because by removing him, they basically made the go-to in power be again Shah, the most popular be Shah. But Mossadegh was a lot more popular at the time. So did the CIA act against a legitimate leader enjoying popular support? Again, a bunch of propaganda to justify what the CIA did. Although there is no doubt that Mossadegh captured the imagination of segments of Iranian society with the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1951, his political support dwindled steadily. Well, if it did dwindle, but why did Zahedi need the CIA support?
Well, why does his support dwindle? maybe because they were completely embargoed and the people blamed him for it.
By August 1953, he did not command mass support. The two-day-hand splitters of the National Front were the only political parties willing to support him. We already read about the Majlis and how the political party splintered in our previous episode and how that was due to what Candella just said. An incredibly heavy embargo and economical problems, workers being laid off, over 20,000 workers being laid off, which was directly British work.
Well, yeah, they were told to return home.
Exactly.
I love how there's a question in there, has the CIA's role been exaggerated?
Yeah, it is amazing because it's themselves. They ask themselves whatever the people might ask, and then they answer it. Like, I'm going to answer you before you ask me because I'm going to gaslight you that way so that you shush. But it's pretty funny because that answer, unless you're like asleep, I don't know how you let that go because that answer doesn't make any sense, contradictory. So here, to a largest extent, the return of the Shah and the downfall of Mossadegh were made possible by divisions amongst the political forces of the left and right. The left splitting amongst nationalist, Marxist, and communists, and the right split amongst the reactionary and xenophobic clergymen and their moral liberal counterparts. The CIA's role was significant. Without Kermit Roosevelt's leadership, guidance, and ability to put some backbone into the key players when they wanted to quit, no one would have moved against Mossadegh. Within the same documents, 2 paragraphs away, they're gaslighting that they were not responsible for what happened, and then kissing the behind of Kermit Roosevelt, saying that without him, this would have never happened. I need Americans to have a bigger attention span, a better attention span, and focus on what you're reading because they're clearly gaslighting y'all. Like, this is crazy.
Surprise!
This is one of the most, like, this is so unprofessional. I don't understand how anybody could take this as a study. The amount of gaslighting back and forth, like you say something and then you say the total opposite in the next paragraph, like contradictory. So there is a lot of questions. Without U.S. intervention, what would have replaced Mossadegh? And obviously here, we're not going to go through this because the U.S., for example, is this researcher is saying that a lot of revisionists contend that the CIA stifled Iran's drive to democracy and strengthened the rules of the autocratic Shah, thereby making Khomeini's revolution all but inevitable, saying that the revolution of the Shah in the 70s was inevitable because of what the US did, which is absolutely, totally right. Because if you have ever heard of Shah Pahlavi, the guy who was basically a puppet to the US, right? That's why he was kind of almost between quotes, restored by the CIA against Mossadegh. You've heard of the Resnick family and their pistachios. Because the pistachios in California, where do those trees come from? They come from Iran. And Iran is the biggest exporter in the world of pistachios. And what did Shah Pahlavi do, who was a puppet to the US? He made snacks at school. I think there is a whole actual article about this. We'll also hopefully put it on the link for this. He made snacks for school a necessity. And in his snacks, every single school will give 1 to 2 bags of pistachios to children in school in Iran. And why did he do that? He did that so that Iran does not export as much pistachios as it used to, so that the American production of pistachios in California has a chance to compete and sell their pistachios in the US. That's how the Resnick family came to power and became rich, and now they own the waters in California. And thank you for, privatizing Fiji and like Fiji water and other things, because now we also have the fires in California, and it's because of them.
Very Chiquita of them.
Mm-hmm. So this is all tied up here. Let's not forget about the Resnick family and what they did with the pistachio, because Iran was a pistachio empire, and it still is. Till today, the Resnick family has given Obama money in 2008, and they financed his campaign because he was enthusiastic about a war with Iran. And the reason is they want to halt Iranian pistachio export 100% so that they make all the money out of it, because they just can't compete. And it is still till today the reason why they lobby and they give money to pro-war, pro-Iran war politicians, because starting a war in Iran is going to be amazing for them, because there's going to be no more pistachios being sold outside. I just wanted to add that segment because it's a very important one on how Shah Pahlavi was a puppet to the US.
And I love how they question, Well, if Germany had won in the First World War, would there have been a World War II?
Mm-hmm.
Bruh, come on.
Yep.
It's so
So
amazing that you destroy a country and then they get pissed off about it. But
yeah,
if it's 25 years later, then oh, those savages.
exactly. This is the thing about the U.S. Because it's a settler colony, always hopes that the indigenous forgets. The indigenous grows old, dies, forgets about what the U.S. has done. So I want to read an excerpt about that.
Yeah, I was going to say, it also sounds like Afghanistan in the 80s.
Mm-hmm. So in removing Mossadegh, the revisionists continue. The United States and Britain effectively strangled traditional Iranian nationalism. Frustrated and resentful, the people rose 25 years later in rage against the Shah and the United States disparaged as the Great Satan, which is an amazing and very, very on point description. For there can be no doubt that despite years of official American and British denials, most Iranians have been convinced of the CIA's role in Mossadegh's fall. Oh, really? Were they?
Not to mention all the damage done before that.
Absolutely. Because let's not forget that what Mossadegh wanted the most was he wanted the oil to be able to serve the people. He wanted to build the infrastructure. He wanted to do things for the country because the country was poor. And
Yeah, it's
why?
impossible.
Because their money went to the UK.
Mm-hmm.
Operation AJAX exerted a powerful influence on the DP's thinking about covert action. Unfortunately, Alan Dulles and others in the DDP did not evaluate their experience critically and apparently drew dubious conclusions. The easy success of the Iranian and Guatemalan operations seemed to herald a golden age of covert action and a sober reappraisal of the utility and flexibility of covert action as a foreign policy instrument did not occur until President John Kennedy fired Dulles after the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. Dulles and his colleagues were correct in regarding covert action as an important weapon of Cold War foreign policy, giving the president the means to halt or reverse developments he deemed harmful to American interests. This capability freed the US from merely reacting to Soviet moves or threats of moves and permitted American action without the threat of direct military confrontation. Moreover, early American covert action successes notified the Soviets that the United States was an able player in the game of high stakes international intrigue it had only recently joined. Leading DDP figures erred in relying on covert action too heavily and resorting to it too readily. As an intelligence officer, Dulles must have recognized the limits and risks of covert action. The success of Project Ajax and Project PB Success, however, was seductive. Kermit Roosevelt's warning that covert actions like TP Ajax would succeed over the long run only with the support of the indigenous military and population fell on deaf ears. The operation in Guatemala seemed to show that both elements could be neutralized quite easily, the military by paramilitary operations and elements of popular opposition by psychological operations. This is a very important part as the US has always played into the psychological warfare and psychological terrorism, which is, for example, paying for certain radio stations and blasting anti-government propaganda, blasting pro-capitalism, pro-imperialist propaganda, racism influencing education via books that have history that is whitewashed and that is pro-US, which is really funny because no history really is pro a settler colony, but whatever. So Peter Gross, Dulles' biographer, writes that the DCI drew a straight line from Guatemala in 1954 to the Bay of Pigs in 1961. Any doubts Dulles may have had about TPA Jax and PB Success vanished as both operations unfolded and benefited from unexpected luck. Both operations may have made Dulles and the DDP overly confident that in these sorts of operations something would turn up that would lead to ultimate success. They miscalculated in assuming and expecting that the Bay of Pigs invasion would follow the same pattern. Again, we're talking about an extremely erratic bunch of people that do not actually follow any type of scientific, how to say that, they don't follow any train of thought. Like there is no actual logic behind the way they plan their invasions. Everything is very sporadic, and everything is just the way they feel about them, how they feel. They are not necessarily also studying fully what could go wrong, the risks. They're not evaluating the risks. They're not thinking about who they're dealing with as a people and as a culture. They are just doing things to do them because their ultimate goal is to create chaos. So perhaps the most important and unique result of Operation AJAX was to strengthen CIA's position within the government as an instrument of policy and solidify its responsibility for clandestine activity. Up to this point, the agency had not been taken seriously. The fall of Mossadegh was a watershed in demonstrating civilian clandestine operation expertise and in putting a civilian intelligence agency at the forefront of planning and executing covert operations. After Operation AJAX, the military could not argue, as it had during the congressional hearings for the National Security Act of 1947, that civilians did not have the background, training, or experience for clandestine activity. This is super important. We'll be talking about this more.
This individual was in love with that word. I think he's used this at least half a dozen times.
The average Iranian still believes that the British and Americans are omnipotent and that if they remove Mossadegh, either or both somehow put the mullahs in power. Edward Shirley's known Thine Enemy, A Spy's Journey into Revolutionary Iran, recounts several conversations he had with Iranians while traveling through that country. One asked Shirley for help. Americans should help us. Your Secretary of State was spit upon by Khomeini. He calls Iran the most evil state in the world, but he does nothing. Unless you want Iranians thinking that you like the mullahs, you should bring them down. The British put them in, and America should drive them out. The young Shah, he is like his father, a coward, and the United States wastes money on him. Iranians don't want to fight anymore. They need a sign from America. Let me just remind everybody who's listening, or we can also just cut this part because that's propaganda full blown.
Mm-hmm.
That this is one person out of 80 million Iranians. Not only this is one person, there is no proof that this is real. There is no proof that that actually happened, that this conversation happened. There is no witness, and there is no legitimacy, as this is a spy who's saying this. And who talks to an American spy, huh? Yeah. Another told Shirley it did not matter what Iranians thought. It only matters what the Americans and the English think. They hold the power. The English have always had the clergy in their pockets.
Boy, is that true.
Mm-hmm. United States murdering Iranian political activist Ali Tabtabai, founder of the Iran Freedom Foundation, in his Bethesda, Maryland home in July 1980. James Phillips, the Challenge of Revolutionary Iran Heritage Foundation Committee, brief number 2429, March 1996. The report, already 5 years old, says that Iran's various tribes have not been a serious threat to Tehran's rule for several years. No reporting since then has unwarranted the qualification or change of that opinion. Look at this. Americans are already looking for the next excuse to invade. So what we have left here is a timeline.
After what Yaz has talked about, this is a lot. This was a lot to swallow between the two episodes. So we're going to give you a brief Operation AJAX timeline for important dates and the events that occurred on these dates. Starting on January 8th, 1951, the Office of National Estimates, ONE, the Central Intelligence Agency, publishes NIE 14, The Importance of Iranian and Middle East oil to Western Europe under peacetime conditions. So an audit to see how much they are going to be losing from nationalization. March 7th, 1951. General Ali Razmar, Iranian Prime Minister, is assassinated a little under 2 months later. March 16th, 1951. ONE publishes SE3, The Current Crisis in Iran. April 5th, 1951, ONE publishes NI6, Iran's Position in the East-West Conflict. April 29th, 1951, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, names Mohammad Mossadegh as Prime Minister of Iran. May 2nd, 1951. Iran nationalizes the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. May 22nd, 1951. ONE publishes SE6, Current Developments in Iran. August 1951, the Anglo-Iranian oil negotiations collapse. September 1951, Britain embargoes ships to Iran of iron, steel, sugar, oil processing equipment, and any other goods that could be resold for dollars. I love how it's resold for oil dollars, not for survival. That is a very capitalist mindset. January 12th, 1952, Iran orders all British consulates closed by January 21st. February 4th, 1952, ONE publishes NIE 46, Probable Developments in Iran in 1952 in the absence of an oil settlement. Again, these are all fantasy. These are all without evidence that these pieces are being published. July 16th, 1952, Mossadegh resigns as prime minister. July 21st, 1952, after 5 days of demonstration and rioting by members of the National Front, the Shah renames Mossadegh prime minister. Remember, he had popular opinion depending upon who you ask. July 31st, 1952, DDP Wisner reports to DCI Smith that the consensus at the meeting at the State Department on July 30th was that for the moment, there was little the CIA could do in Iran. That's because it wasn't hurting the U.S. yet. October 14th, 1952, ONE publishes SE33, Prospects for Survival of Mossadegh Regime in Iran. October 22nd, 1952, Iran breaks off diplomatic relations with Britain. November 13th, 1952, ONE publishes the NIE 75, Probable Developments in Iran through 1953. So again, this is where they're building up their Soviet wet dreams and fantasies, because they are just so afraid of communism that they're going to just publish something that has no evidence again with any basis for argument.
I would love to add to that the US has historically taken this route and this path when it comes to, they're setting a precedent in order to justify their actions once they do them. For example, I will give a very brief example. The US did a coup in 2007 in Palestine, in the Palestinian territories, and they used Mohammed Dahlan against Hamas. They didn't accept the fact that Hamas won the election. And they have been said in a bunch of trails and paper trails that are saying that Hamas is terrible, Hamas this, Hamas that, in order to justify the genocide that they knew they were going to commit at some point, which is ongoing right now, which has always been ongoing, honestly, for the past 75 years. But this is a tactic that the US has always done, creating a bunch of assumptions and making it seem like a study, like a real study, like a legitimate study. And a bunch of assumptions made by people that are obviously biased, because who is making this? It's like going to someone who's going to bid on a market and telling them, what do you think about the market? I think the market is going to be great. I'm going to bid on it. It's the same people. The CIA, their estimate office, is the one who's making the assumptions because they need to work. The CIA got to be deployed somewhere. They got to make money. And we have seen this being done in so many countries. They did the same in Chile against Allende. They set up a bunch of non-existent numbers and non-existent estimates that cannot be verified at all and that do not make any sense in order to say that Allende is bad. And the reason was he was nationalizing the land and nationalizing the companies, and obviously slavers from the US, colonizers from the US, who had obviously land there and were using this population as a slave labor, pretty much, were losing their land. Not their land, but the land they stole and they colonized. So obviously they just pay the CIA to do what they want to do. And again, the Dulles companies actually have been, it's been demonstrated that they have shares in a lot of these fruit companies. So this is a very standard procedure for the US, leaving a paper trail in order to justify, in order to skew, because first of all, that serves as skewing the point of view of people. Because if you hear enough bad stuff, for example, we do that with China, if you hear enough bad stuff about China, you will be anti-Chinese because you're brainwashed into it. So the day the US bombs China, you don't feel bad because you've been propagandized and prepared for this. The same way you hear that Mao was bad to his people and he killed this and he killed that, and later on, the Chinese are communists and dictators, whatever. But that there is a reason for that. It's in order to facilitate and to manufacture consent. Manufacturing Consent is a very important book. That
Yeah, I was gonna say, great book.
It's an amazing book. Maybe we'll go through it sometimes, but Noam Chomsky and Lerman did an amazing work on that, and they show how the media manufactures consent, and that the media basically is paid for by the government, which is true. 75%, I believe, of the budget of the media comes from the government or something like that. So, I mean, these are the numbers from the book from the 80s, I believe. So it's been a long time, but yeah.
Media is very important. That's why Sabotáge zines are a great gift for everyone.
Excuse my co-host. Sometimes she's American. What can I say?
Just to let you know, she muted her mic so she couldn't laugh on camera.
Yes, I did, because that was so corny.
And back to our timeline. So we are now in November of 1952. So November 20th, 1952, the National Security Council issues NSC 136/1, the present situation in Iran. Now, remember our timeline for Syria. So while they were messing stuff up in Syria, they were also coinciding with this at the same time. And it was very rapid fire because, as we've seen, everything that's already happened, I mean, we're only like a little over a year into this. In Syria, we saw, 9 regime changes in like 23 months?
Absolutely, starting from 1949. Well, the meddling being there the whole time, but the coup started in 1949. So we can say that around this time, I mean, there is even proof that there was correspondence because we know that Syria and Iran are very close to each other.
Mm-hmm. February 26th, 1953, a sad day in history. Alan Dulles is sworn in as DCI. March 1953, Undersecretary of State Walter Bedell Smith concludes that Mossadegh's tenure in office is inimical to U.S. interest. State Department authorizes CIA to consider operations that would replace Mossadegh. So, because of U.S. interest, another government needs to be overthrown in their own country and then labeled terrorist. We have girl math. This is called CIA math. May 28th, 1953. Prime Minister Mossadegh asked President Eisenhower for American financial aid. So that there shows that he is willing to work with America, even though America is trying to destroy them. June 3rd, 1953. Ambassador Henderson arrives in Washington for consultations. June 8th, 1953. Ambassador Henderson briefed on Operation AJAX in Washington. June 29th, 1953. President Eisenhower informs Mossadegh that Iran will not receive further U.S. aid until the oil nationalization issue is resolved. They should put resolved in quotations there, because technically it was resolved. It just didn't benefit them.
Absolutely. They don't accept that because it's a no. It's a rejection. It was resolved by get out of here. But that's not an answer to them. It's not a valid answer. So by resolved, they mean that they want to keep, obviously, control and power over it.
Right. And they're asking for aid because they've been embargoed by the U.S. as well as other NATO countries, including the UK. July 11th, 1953. President Eisenhower, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and DCI Alan Dulles approve Operation AJAX. Now remember, when we were reading this document earlier, it said that President Eisenhower had no knowledge of this operation and didn't approve it or had no involvement. But yet CIA operations had to go through him. And just magically on page 98 of this document, it confirms that he was a part of it.
Please always read the full documents and stay focused. If you need to take a day off to go, and like have some rest and come back and read them, but attention here is key. They always snitch on themselves. They always do. You just got to be attentive enough to catch it. Thank you for that comment. That was great.
Yeah, don't read all of it at once, otherwise you'll become a lunatic like we are. July 21st, 1953. In Tehran, the National Front and the Tudeh Party staged demonstrations commemorating July 21st, 1952. July 23rd, 1953. British Ambassador to the United States Roger Miller-Makins presents assurances to the Undersecretary of State Walter Bedell Smith that the UK government would be flexible in its approach to the oil question. they would be flexible now because they have U.S. support. July 25th, 1953, Princess Ashraf arrives in Tehran. Now remember, she was not welcome, and she was not allowed to stay.
Yeah, she was in exile pretty much.
Yeah. July 28th, 1953, Secretary of State Dulles gives a press conference in which he says, the recent developments in Iran, especially the growing activity of the supposedly illegal Communist Party, which appears to be tolerated by the Iranian government, have caused us concerns. I want to highlight virtually two words here that really stuck out here. Supposedly and appears, meaning there's no factual evidence to involve either one of these, but yet we're worried about it. So we are worried about a hypothetical situation. The US government is a hypochondriac. Recent developments in Iran, especially the growing activity of the supposedly illegal Communist Party, which appears to be tolerated by the Iranian government, have caused us concerns.
That just sounds like mental gymnastics, full blown. Yeah, no, this is absolutely insane. They admitted that Eisenhower was orchestrated the CIA coup, and they also said it earlier. They said, "Well, there's no way like the CIA coups always have to go through the president and get the permission. You cannot have a coup if it doesn't go through the president." But at the same time, they said that he might not have anything to do with the CIA coup, and then later on come back and say that, oh well, we did it because we thought that the Communist Party was going to take over. But the truth is, and this I've read this also in some CIA declassified documents, some CIA documents say that the only move of Mossadegh of nationalizing oil was a communist move and showed his intentions as a communist or as a socialist or whatever. So that alone deserved intervention.
July 29th, 1953, Princess Ashraf meets with the Shah, but is unable to convince him to dismiss Mossadegh. That's probably because he was scared. Princess Ashraf leaves Tehran at the request of Mossadegh's government after having spoken with the Shah. August 4th, 1953, President Eisenhower states at the governor's conference in Seattle that the U.S. will not stand by and let Asian nations fall behind the Iron Curtain. Again, assumption. August 7th, 1953, Asandollah Rashidian again meets with the Shah, who agrees that action should be taken on the 10th or 11th of August. August 12th, 1953, Colonel Netmatollah Nasri, commander of the Shah's Imperial Guard, takes the Firmans by plane to Ramsar. August 13th, 1953, late in the evening, Colonel Nasri returns to Tehran with the signed Firmans. August 15th and 16th, 1953, during the night of the 15th/16th, Colonel Nasri tries to deliver the Firmans to Mossadegh, dismissing him, but is arrested. General Taji Rahi, Mossadegh's chief of staff, has troops at strategic points in Tehran, which we all know how that went. August 16th, 1953, at 5:45, Radio Tehran announces an abortive coup. At 0600, Mossadegh meets with the cabinet to receive reports of the situation. August 16th, 1953, Radio Tehran broadcast a message at noon from Mossadegh. According to the will of the people expressed by referendum, the 17th Majlis is dissolved. Elections for the 18th session will soon be held. August 16th, 1953, Minister of Foreign Affairs Fatemi holds a press conference at 1400 hours in which he makes an anti-Shah statement or statements. August 16th, 1953, crowds amass in the Majlis Square around 1930 hours to hear speeches attacking the Shah. Crowds learn for the first time that the Shah has fled. August 17th, 1953, Radio Tehran at 10:30 calls on General Zahidi to surrender. August 18th, 1953, Shah leaves Baghdad for Rome on a commercial flight. Some morning newspapers run copies of the Firman. Also on August 18th, sporadic violence breaks out. August 19th, 1953, pro-Shah groups assemble at 0900 in the Tehran Bazaar. Newspapers continue to print the Firmans and alleged interviews with Zahedi quoted as insisting that his government is the only legal government. So we have some propaganda there. Continuing on the 19th, pro-Shah truckloads of soldiers posted in mid-morning at key points in Tehran. General Rahi tells Mossadegh at 10:30 that he is no longer in control of the army. Radio Tehran falls into the hands of royalists at 14:20. Zahedi speaks over Radio Tehran at 17:25. He seems to be consolidating his hold over the government. This was when he was trying to justify and tell the people about how good he was, which is skeptical at best. And finishing up on the 19th of August in 1953, Mossadegh's house is destroyed in the evening around 1900 hours. December 5th, 1953, United Kingdom and Iran agree to reestablish diplomatic relations. An Iranian military court in Tehran sentences Mossadegh to 3 years in solitary confinement for disobeying the Shah's orders, dismissing him, and for dissolving the Majlis.
Thank you so much for that. This was the timeline of Operation AJAX. I'd just like to add here, because we did not even talk about this, just a very important part, that Mossadegh was imprisoned for 3 years, and then he was put under house arrest until his death and was buried in his own home to prevent political furor. And I would like to add some more information, and we're almost done actually with the CI documents that we've been reading through. Again, just a reminder, it's 139 pages CI document. Thank you for hanging tight with us the whole time, and we'll add some more information and then be done. So in the summer of 1953, the OCI was responsible for keeping the president informed about daily events that might affect U.S. policy. The OCI conducted its analysis of the unfolding events in Iran in ignorance of the developing American role. This shows you that there was not as much coordination going on, and that these are groups that sometimes are competing against each other. The problem identified was unfortunately old and persistent. R. Jack Smith, later a deputy director for intelligence, was the head of the current intelligence staff of the Office of Reports and Estimates in the old Central Intelligence Group. In his book, The Unknown CIA, My 3 Decades with the Agency, Smith writes that clandestine reporting was absent from the current intelligence publications his office produced. He later discovered the reason. Rather than going to analysts, the best clandestine reports were being hand-carried by top clandestine services people over to senior people in the White House, the State Department, and the Pentagon. In contrast, Smith's office saw most inconsequential scraps of information about foreign personalities, especially the officer of local communist cells. Analysts routinely were denied access to critical information from clandestine sources, but Smith, not knowing differently, thought that what he had was the best American espionage could offer. And it was not. After Project Ajax tried to develop closer personal ties with the DDP on his own, he did not expect DDP to tell him what was going on at the time, but he wanted to develop relationships so that they would trust me enough that they might tell me things that otherwise wouldn't get on paper, and so on. And by the same token, to demonstrate to them that we could help them. This is basically someone talking about, from the Office of Estimates, talking about their relationship to the DDP, where Alan Dulles is. At least in the case of Project Ajax, the relationship between the DDP and the DI contrasted sharply with the relationship between the DDP and the State Department. After the operation, John Statesman of State sent a letter to Roy Melbourne, first secretary of the embassy in Tehran, telling him of the close personal relationships he had developed with CIA's John Waller and Roger Gorin. John Waller and Roger Gorin are men. Statesman wrote, upon whose judgment we can rely without qualification, and Arthur Richards, director of the Office of Greek, Turkish, and Iranian Affairs, Department of State, and I have been happy to observe that they go out of their way to maintain friendly and close relations with us, asking our advice often upon subjects which their organization might not normally discuss with working levels in the department. The highest levels of management in the CIA did nothing to discourage the estrangement of the Directorate of Plans from the Directorate of Intelligence, the DP and the DI, and in fact reinforced it. Alan Dulles ignored the agency's analytical arm during Project Ajax, preferring to use personal acquaintances as sources of information. He had numerous contacts across the world and throughout American society from his pre-war days as an attorney and his wartime service in the OSS.
Which, if you guys remember, we talked about the OSS in, I think, our second and third episodes on Operation Underworld, and in the and the Operation Husky episode, and the International Longshoremen's episode.
So the institutional ties never inhibited Allen from nurturing his own private networks of diverse colleagues and friends, many dating back decades, upon whom he would call in his regular trips to Europe for civilized exchanges among men and increasingly women of the world. Talking about spying, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
Personal relationships were important to Dulles, and he tended to trust the information he got from people he knew. On Iran, much of his information came from Brigadier General H. Norman Schwarzkopf, very important name, Norman Schwarzkopf, and Max Thornburg, an oil company executive. There is no evidence that Dulles ever passed on information from these sources to analysts in the Estimate Office or the OCI. So Schwarzkopf is the father of the American general that headed the coalition forces in the Gulf War. The guy who invaded Iraq in 1992. That's his father. He's also a Schwarzkopf. So his father advised Dulles and gave Dulles information about Iran. They always come in families. It's pretty sad. There is actually an interview on the Gulf War, and he was head also of the state police. So Schwarzkopf was head of state police at the time and investigated the Lindenberg kidnapping in the early 1930s. For the background activities of Thornburg's in Iran from 1947 to 1951, there is a book called The Catalyst of Nationalization, Max Thornburg and the Failure of Private Sector Developmentalism in Iran, Diplomatic History. So this is the guy who was given information. Thornburg and Schwarzkopf were given information to Dulles. Thornburg, an oil tycoon, pretty much, and Schwarzkopf, a general whose son would later invade Iraq, the brightest of the bunch.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting, furthering the internal problems in the CIA. There's about 3 paragraphs with blanked out names talking about how there was payoffs inside their own government, inside their own body of investigation, and how there were false ties made for privied information.
Mm-hmm.
So this company that claimed, or well, I'm going to call it a company because it's not an organization. So this entity that the government uses had its own buy-offs and payouts within its own walls.
Absolutely. So Schwarzkopf had spent considerable time in Iran, had trained the Iranian gendarmerie during World War II, and knew the Shah well. His knowledge extended beyond Tehran because the gendarmerie operated in provinces across the country. Through his work with this police force, Schwarzkopf became a storehouse of knowledge about Iran and was happy to share it with Dulles. Max Thornburg ran Overseas Consultants Incorporated, a firm that advised the Middle Eastern government on oil and economic questions. In 1950, he was in Iran as a consultant to the government, advising Iranian officials about the country's 7-year economic plan. Basically, a bunch of spies, pretty much. So Thornburg gained unusual access to the then Deputy Director Plans, Allen Dulles, and key State Department officials. He maintained a steady correspondence with both the CIA and state about events in the Middle East. He was not shy about telling Allen what he thought should be done and constantly urged that the US had to change the psychological climate in the Middle East. He also argued that the Shah was not weak, but only young, beaten down, and understandably skeptical about any real support coming from the United States or Britain. Thornburg sat in on several sessions with Dulles and drafted some papers for the CIA. This was the extra information I wanted to add in there. Thank you so much for listening to us. This was our last episode on the CIA coup against Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 in Iran. This was Yasmine.
And I'm Candy. Please make sure to follow us on all social media accounts. This is a bi-weekly, as of now, podcast show. We do have our zines available in the TikTok shop, which we are getting word is back up and running. So go check those out, please. We have 5 issues in our own shop, and we also have 2 of our issues with Decolonized Covent on their TikTok shop, as well as decolonizationcovent.com. They have those same issues. But we really appreciate you guys. Even our small following is getting bigger every day. So we thank you. Again, please follow us on all social media accounts, including Red Note, Lemonade, and Blue Sky Social. And we're on all the normal ones as well.
Thank you so much. We hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you for the next one.
Yep. Thanks for being here. Bye.
Bye.